Today, our topic is navigating COVID-19, key legal issues for entrepreneurs to consider, presented by Jordan and Abby from Miller Thompson. Thank you, Jordan and Abby, for joining us today. Please start whenever you're ready.
Okay, can everybody hear us as well? I wish everyone could just give me a thumbs up. Okay, perfect. As mentioned, my name is Jordan. I'm an associate here in our Saskatoon office. I've been an associate here for about 5 years. My main practice areas, I deal with corporate law, but more specifically with charities, nonprofits, charitable foundations. And my connection to WESC is I run WESC's All Access legal program. So I'm sure a number of you I've met through the program, which is basically where we offer free, or I think it costs about $50 to sign up for an hour session with one of the lawyers here from Miller Thompson. I love the program. The program, it's an exciting way for me to kind of get the inside scoop on up and coming businesses in Saskatchewan. So that's why I enjoy it. And if you don't know about the program, please schedule an appointment and we can get to know each other.
And my name is Abby Truslin, and I'm the articling student here at the office. So I'm here just to assist in any way I can.
Okay, thanks, Abby. So, as titled in our presentation, today we're going to talk about navigating COVID, key legal considerations for your small businesses. We know that COVID's having an enormous impact on Canadian businesses, and they're still requiring to operate. So what we've done here is we've come up with, I guess I'll back up here a little bit. The first thing we're going to do with our agenda is we're going to provide you with an update on the current state of affairs here in Saskatchewan. From there, we're going to move into what we've thought were some key legal considerations for you and your small businesses. And lastly, hopefully we'll leave some time for discussions and some questions. I do want to note here that all the information that we're providing today is informative only, and it's not considered to be legal advice. If you do have specific legal advice, you can reach out to either your personal lawyer directly or either Abby or I, and we're happy to help with any specific scenarios. The other thing I wanted to comment on is the laws and the regulations and the guidelines surrounding COVID are rapidly changing. They're changing every day, every hour. They were changing up until we started this presentation. So please take what we say with a grain of salt and just be aware that whatever's said today might change the moment after this presentation ends. So starting with the current state of affairs in Saskatchewan, as most of you would know, the way that the Saskatchewan government has tackled COVID is they've created this reopening phase, and they've split the reopening phase into 5 different stages. Currently, we have entered into phase 4. Phase 5 is the last stage of reopening, and it includes some permanent lifting of restrictions. The government hasn't provided a set date for stage 5, other than saying it's probably going to be sometime in 2021. So this phase 4, I think we're in it for the long haul. What the government has done with this phase 4 is they've broken it up into basically sub phases. So I think we're in about, I don't even know, I think about 4.8. And as per the phase 4 sub phases in July, what the government has done is continue to allow more and more businesses to reopen. So many businesses are permitted to reopen with proper health and safety measures in place. So there's basically a list of allowable businesses and a list of non-allowable businesses. Most businesses are allowed to operate now. As of last week, I think the most recent update was garage sales and yard sales are allowed to operate, as well as conferences and banquets. And then how the reopening is working is essentially there's legislation in place, public health emergency legislation, that provides the Ministry of Health with the ability to create public health orders. So the Ministry of Health has issued a public health order that's currently in place. And what the public health order says that relates to businesses is that allowable businesses are permitted to operate, provided that they operate in a way that prevents the transmission of COVID-19. So that is the minimum requirement for these businesses that are allowed to operate, is that they have to do so in a manner that prevents the transmission of COVID-19. From there, the government has issued many reopening plans and guidelines that are catered towards different sectors and provides guidelines in which how these businesses are supposed to operate. The language in the guidelines, while they're supposed to just be permissive and they're supposed to be guidelines, the language in the guidelines is quite obligatory. It says words like must, it says businesses shall, it says businesses cannot do this or cannot do that. And so while they're framed as guidelines, it's being inferred that these guidelines are actually mandatory. What else can I say about the guidelines? There's different guidelines. So there's a guideline online that you can see. I've got the website posted here. There's a guideline online that has to do with workplaces generally, which is what I'm going to be talking about in the presentation. There are also specific guidelines for different sectors. So for instance, there's a guideline for the restaurant industry and the guidelines that they must follow. But we're focusing here on just the general the general workplace guidelines. And again, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to just put them in the chat box, and we'll either answer them as we go, or it might work better just to answer them at the end. So with that said, moving into our first scenario, what we have here is as businesses resume operations, more employees are moving back into the office and/or stores are opening to the public. You are wondering what unique issues arise by virtue of these workplaces. So on the slide here, we put a couple of different considerations for employers to consider in terms of what their responsibilities are under the legislation. We have ensured that employees' workspaces are safe and free from hazards, implement minimum standards as set out in the public health order, consider whether working from home or remotely remains practicable, and establishing clear incident and injury reporting protocols. In terms of the guidelines, what we have done here is I've gone through most of the workplace guidelines and summarized up on this slide some of the guidelines that I think are a bit more particular and or interesting to small businesses. So the first one I have up here is workplaces are exempt from the restrictions on indoor and outdoor gatherings. So the gatherings right now, the restrictions are, I believe it's 30 people, both indoors and outdoors, unless it's a wedding, a grad, or a funeral. Workplaces are exempt from those public gathering restrictions. However, 2 meter distancing between individuals should still be maintained. And if this is not possible, other measures should be used, such as self-monitoring of personal health or supervision by either an infection prevention and control or occupational health and safety staff. Interestingly enough, under the guidelines, a lot of people have been asking me whether businesses have to wear masks. Under the guidelines, only those businesses that are in the healthcare profession are required to wear masks. The guidelines actually say if you are able to maintain a 2 meter distance and implement other types of measures, they ask that businesses not divert masks from the healthcare sector, which I found kind of interesting. Commonly touched areas and shared equipment must be cleaned and disinfected at least twice daily or when visibly soiled. They provide some examples: light switches, door handles, toilets, taps, handrails, etc. Businesses are asked to assign staff to dedicated work areas as much as possible and discourage from sharing phones, desks, or other equipment. Employers are asked to provide employees with access to tissues, no-touch trash receptacles, hand soaps, alcohol-based hand sanitizers, disinfectants, and disposable towels. This one, just where PPE is required, there's certain protocols in place for how they have to be cleaned and dealt with and disposed of. And again, actually, I have here too, where did I just see this here? Valuable PPE resources are not to be diverted from the healthcare system. And businesses are also asked to have a workplace illness policy in place, which deals with issues such as when somebody has to stay home for, they have symptoms of COVID, and disinfection of work areas of a sick employee who has been at work. So those are kind of the highlights of the guidelines. Again, they're quite extensive. There's a lot of content in there. You can find it on the government website if you're interested. And again, there are further guidelines specific to different sectors. Okay, moving into our next consideration. This one I'll be relatively brief. Your commercial contracts no longer reflect pre-COVID expectations or protect you from new risks arising in this post-COVID world. Our consideration here is that you should revisit your commercial contracts with a few different things in mind. The first is the application of the force majeure clause on a second wave. I'm sure some of you have heard about this topic. It's kind of a hot topic, at least in the legal world. A force majeure clause is a clause in contracts that basically provides the ability for one party or the other to breach a contract because of reasoning that's outside of their control. So oftentimes a force majeure clause will say something along the lines of due to an act of God, due to sometimes it'll include a list such as disasters, floods, tornadoes, pandemics. So it's a clause in there that's been in contracts for a long time, but only recently has it gained some attention. So when you're looking at your commercial contracts, whether it's a current contract or a future contract, I would take a look at those contracts to see whether that force majeure clause is in there. And if it's not in there and you're renegotiating new contracts, consider implementing some type of force majeure clause into those agreements. Now, the enforceability of a force majeure clause is questionable, and it's entirely dependent on the circumstances as well as the language that you use to implement the force majeure clause. So going forward, looking towards some potential second wave, you might want to consider language included in that force majeure clause that's specific to pandemics or what's another word for pandemic?
Just like an emergency shutdown.
Emergency shutdown, yeah, something that's more likely to encompass what we're going through.
Mm-hmm.
The second is your expectations for each party in the event of a second wave. We've just put this up here generally, so when you're reviewing contracts or looking to enter into a future contract that you're considering in the event that there's a second wave, what are the rights and responsibilities of each party, and how does each party have the ability to adjust the contract or terminate the contract in the event that there is a second wave? Whether this is your lease agreements, supply agreements, employment agreements, we've just put this up there to consider your contracts with the view of there being a second, third, fourth wave. And finally, we have up here, consider electronic signatures. Now, this was a little more prominent when we were in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, going forward, in the event that there's a big second wave, electronic signatures, broadly speaking, across Canada, are considered valid and considered equal to a written signature. Now, there are certain exceptions, but broadly speaking, those electronic signatures are considered valid. So it might be if you're entering into a new agreement that you don't need to get together with the other party and sign with wet ink, and you can do so and exchange the documents electronically.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, moving on to our next consideration, I'm going to pass it off to Abby.
Thanks. So this situation is that you're having a difficult time finding private financing and need to figure out what other avenues exist to obtain funding. So we recommend looking into all the different economic measures that the government, either federally or provincially, have put in place for companies to look at getting public funding. So if you could just move to the next slide. So I'm sure most of you are aware of the CERB, which is the Canada Emergency Response Benefit Plan, or the CEWS, which is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. And because they are so well known, I won't go into full detail, but if you have any questions on them, please feel free to ask either in the chat or at the end. So looking at this main list, this is what we found that might be most relevant to you in your business currently. So the top four, the CEBA, the EDC, the BCAP, and the BDC, they're all essentially related, but they're all federal funding programs that may be available to you as an owner-operated or small business. The CEBA allows for a $40,000 interest-free loan from the bank that you go to. And should be noted that you should make sure that you understand when that needs to be paid back, because, for example, the Export Development Corporation, the EDC loan guarantee program, has to be paid back within 1 year. This and they're both related, those two, this amount of funding that you can get. When you look at the only difference in funding that you could obtain from within those four is underneath the Business Development Bank of Canada co-lending, which this was created to help out for providing loans for operating and liquidity to businesses that were financially viable and generating income prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. This program has three components. So if you are making less than $1 million of revenue, you can get a loan of up to $312,500. If you're making in between $1 million and $50 million, you can get a loan up to $3.125 million. And if you're over $50 million, you can get a loan of up to $6.25 million. The nice thing with that is that you have the first 12 months, there's no interest that you are paying, and you have up to 10 years to pay back that loan. So it might be something to look into if you're looking for something a little bit more long-term than just repaying within the year. Another one that we found that might be relevant is the Entrepreneurs, Innovators, and Pre-Revenue Support funding from the Government of Canada. They're planning to inject $20.1 million to support ongoing lending to entrepreneurs through Funtrepreneur Canada. So you might want to look into that. And they haven't noted anything as of right now, but it might be coming in the next few months as to what that all means or how to apply for that. There's also the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund that may be applicable to you. Again, they haven't mentioned anything specific for the Saskatchewan fund, but they are going to devote up to $962 million into that area, which may be applicable to you. Something that we thought was interesting and very applicable here was the Women's Enterprise Initiative, which is WEI. So the Government of Canada has announced that they're willing to invest $8.3 million to support Women's Enterprise Initiative to organizations across Canada in effort to help combat many women who have been negatively affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, they haven't exactly discussed how that's going to be given out or what is all required for that, but that's something to keep in your back pocket in case you may need funding in the next little bit here. As well, the Federal Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program, which I'm sure some of you might be aware of, which provides forgivable loans to eligible commercial property owners experiencing rent shortfalls because their small business tenants have been heavily impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. There's also within that, if you are a tenant who have been struggling to pay your rent, there was also various ways that you can have a forgivable rent for that month or a different part of percentage of rent that you're paying. And looking more provincially, there's also a temporary commercial eviction protection for small business tenants. And again, as Jordan had said, things are constantly changing. So I would make sure if you are looking for that option to look into it a little bit more or ask someone to make sure that it hasn't been changed when you go to apply for it. And lastly, the Emergency Support Program for Saskatchewan small businesses. So the Government of Saskatchewan announced a $50 million program to provide financial support to small and medium-sized businesses that have had to temporarily close or significantly curtail operations as a result of the pandemic. And that's through the Saskatchewan Small Business Emergency Payment. And I know that's a lot of information. And so if you have any questions, I think we're going to be sending out the PowerPoint afterwards, just so you have an understanding of what these all are, but feel free to ask any questions about them. Do you want to go through questions now or move on to the...
I think maybe we'll just address all the questions at the
Sure.
end. I think that's probably the easiest way to do it.
Sure. So if you can move to the next slide. So another key area that we thought we should mention is governance considerations. So for example, you have new legal issues arising from all directions and you wonder what flexibility you have in dealing with your corporate requirements. The consideration here is that you really need to be mindful of transitional governance principles in your constating documents. For example, you need to have a good understanding of who are your directors and shareholders and what are their job duties and requirements. You need to make sure that you have your articles in order, your bylaws, your policies, as well as your understanding of the duties to your entity or organization. And lastly, and I think this is a very main point, is just keeping proper records of that. Now, more than ever, is an important time to ensure that your corporate governance is up to date. All companies, big and small, can benefit from implementing corporate governance practices as they all compete in an environment where good governance is a huge business imperative for such things as raising capital, securing debt, attracting and maintaining talented, qualified directors, meeting the demands and expectations of sophisticated shareholders, and preparing for potential acquisition, exit, or next phase of growth. I know regardless of a pandemic, making sure all of your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, and everything is in place so that you understand what you can do and what you cannot do is a huge thing, especially now in a pandemic. In more specific things that you should just be thinking about in relation to governance considerations during COVID, and some of this has already been mentioned, is just making sure that you have health and safety measures in place of, as Jordan mentioned, that there's a plan for if someone in your office or in your company has COVID, what do you do? What can they do? As well, you should consider succession and contingency planning. So for those directors, you should have an understanding of what they're doing and what happens if they aren't able to work on something at any given time or if they have to be at home. You should also make sure that you have various management incentives. I know right now can be a little bit unsure of what money is coming in, but just having an understanding of how things are being moved around and what payment measures are going out to your directors and your employees. With that is also keeping your liquidity in mind, making sure that you know where you're at as a company and what you have coming in, what you have going out. Further, you should consider your shareholder dynamics, your employee compensation, the fundraising that you want to be doing or how you can be doing it a little bit differently during all the changes that we've discussed. As well, just keeping up to date with any legislative relief, just making sure that you have an understanding what's changing each day. There's also, as Jordan mentioned, any renegotiation of contracts that may need to be done because of changes that have affected your shipment or something coming in due to COVID. And just prepare for the new normal is essentially what this slide is getting to, is just understanding what you have as a company and how can you operate in this unprecedented time that we're in right now.
Yeah, and I think further to what Abby has said here, the reason we put this slide up as one of the considerations in the pandemic is because as a corporate entity, I mean, many of you might be operating as sole proprietors, but for those of you who are incorporated, there's, pursuant to the legislation and pursuant to your governing documents, there's different decisions that are made at each level of the organization. So whether there's certain day-to-day decisions that are made by your officers, by your president, your CEOs, there's different decisions that are made at the director level, and then there's different decisions that need to be made at the shareholder level. Now, oftentimes for smaller entities, each of these levels is the same person. So the one person is the president, who's also the director, who is also the sole shareholder of the company. But it's important, particularly during a time when things are in flux and nobody knows what the next day is going to bring, to have those documents properly organized so that you can turn to them for guidance. And if you're looking for funding or if you're looking for grants or anything of the sort, banks, government, anybody is going to be asking to see your constating documents. So that would be your articles or your bylaws and your minute books and your resolutions. And so if you can have those in order as you go along, then it's much easier to get that funding or to be able to make those decisions down the road when everything is in place properly. Okay, So I think we'll maybe go backwards to some of the questions. I saw lots of awesome questions that were being asked. Veronique was asking about cost sharing programs that are in place. So under employment legislation, employment and public health legislation, outside of the COVID context, an employer has a duty to keep a safe and healthy workplace for their employees. So whether that's in a pandemic or not, that's the employer's responsibility. I've not seen anything to the contrary, but the government has taken, and legislation has taken, the position that that's an employer cost that's to be borne by the employer. And I don't think that there's been any suggestion of a cost sharing system in place that where the employees might share in some of that cost. I did also want to note that reminded me of something else I wanted to note, was that I've had a couple businesses ask me about the repercussions of not following or not complying with the guidelines. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's the public health order and then there's the guidances. Under the public health order, the legislation that gives the Ministry of Health the ability to make that order, there's enforcement mechanisms. So the risk of not complying lies in somebody complaining. So if nobody complains, it's unlikely that they have inspectors out inspecting every single business, but the risk is that somebody complains and then you get an inspector out looking into and investigating the business. In my opinion, I think it's doubtful. There are fines under the legislation. The fines are pretty significant. They can range up to like $75,000. In my personal opinion, I don't think they'd be giving out fines immediately. They'd probably be first offering some sort of plan to get you back on track. And I've not heard of any businesses in Saskatchewan as of yet being fined, but I have heard of some businesses in both Ontario and British Columbia where somebody contracted COVID at the business, where that business faced pretty significant fines under that public health emergency legislation. So again, it's important for businesses to be aware of the risks. And again, the guidelines aren't legislatively required, but I think if you're not complying with the guidelines, then you're at risk of liability, I guess. Okay, let's see what else we've got here. Home businesses, I think I saw that Wes could answer that question a little bit further below. Do we have links to everything mentioned? Some of what you mentioned was not in the PowerPoint slides. Abby, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can make sure the links are in my notes underneath. So when we send those out, I'll make sure that they're there for you to go look at.
Yeah, and I know that Abby had mentioned in some of her research, some of it's just been government announcements, and I don't think there's been any implementation of the programs that are going to be offered. They've just sort of committed to giving certain amounts of money to specific situations. So other than the links, I know the government has a lot of assistance on their website that directs you to all the different types of programs that are available. Available to rewatch.
I think it's being recorded, so I think it should be able to be rewatched.
And it'd be helpful to have more detail about the slide that outlines the programs available to support small businesses. So again, we were just providing this. The presentation itself wasn't focused on government funding available. We just, knowing the audience that was going to be attending the presentation, we thought that this would be helpful. So this is just a very broad overview of the programs that are available. Abby can provide some links.
Yeah, I'll make sure that the links are clear if we send the slides out so that you can go look in them. The hard part is that a lot of it is just it's here, and so you kind of have to dig quite deeply to figure out where you apply or how you get into that, but I'll make sure to have links there for you so that you can understand and see if you can find where you can apply for those.
Yeah, and the reason we put these ones up here on the slides was because we know that a lot of people are aware of some of the bigger programs, and we just sort of wanted to at least bring to your attention some of the ones that you might want to look into. And if you want us to look into it as well, just feel free to email either Abby or I, and we're happy to
Yeah.
do so.
And another thing on that, a lot of them did mention that most of the banks, whether it be just a big Canada bank or the credit unions that we have here in Saskatchewan, are aware of all of these and are more than willing to help you learn how to apply through those just through your bank. So that is something if you are considering just reaching out to your bank and asking them any questions too, but we can give the links.
Okay. Okay, well, the presentation has run a little shorter than we expected. But if anybody has any more questions, we're happy to answer them about the guidelines generally, about best practices with your businesses. It looks like Wesk might be typing.
I think a lot of the challenges right now with the funding and different areas that the government is saying that they're funding, it's just everything is happening so quickly. And so they're saying, oh, we're going to be giving X amount of money and here's the eligibility for that. It's almost like everyone's playing catch up to get to that, to understand what. So I'm sorry to hear that your bank wasn't very helpful.
Okay, well, I guess if there's no other questions, then we'll pass it back to Wesk.
Thank you for your question.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for sharing today. I will just touch on a couple of things quickly. So this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our website to rewatch it by the end of the day today, as well as Wesk has a loan up to $40,000 as part of the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund, and applications for that is open, and the link should be in the chat or you can find it on our website. So yeah, thanks once again and have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining in today.
Thanks for joining, everybody.